Hello and welcome to another episode of Faces of the MRM. I'm here with a good friend, David Shackleton. He is a member of the NCFM, the National Coalition for Men, which is where I met him. And David, you said to me that you don't call yourself a men's rights activist. You say instead that you're part of the men's movement. Can you explain a
Yes.
little bit about why that is?
Yes, I think that men's rights is not what I'm interested in, really. I think rights is the wrong focus. Uh, Jordan Peterson spends a lot of time talking about responsibilities, and look at the response that he gets from people. And I think that the focus that I want to talk that I want to make is on men's issues and women's issues. And the issues that men have tend to be overlooked, and the issues that women have tend to be prioritized. And it's that imbalance that I am trying to correct. So that's
Eh,
why I use the term that I'm a member of the men's movement because I focus on men's issues, not men's rights.
Okay, and we'll get into that in a second, but if I can just ask you about your time and your membership in the National Coalition for Men, how you got there and what it means to you and what your experience is like.
Yes, I was looking for a support group um, for for me, just connections with men that go a little deeper than the sort of jocularity that often passes for male friendship. And um, I wanted a place where I could talk about what was really going on for me with people who would understand, and some of the travails of being an activist in the men's movement, and uh, and get a sympathetic ear for that. And so that's why I joined the NCFN.
And you're in Canada.
I'm in Canada. Yeah, I live near Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada.
And Canada is one of the countries you hear particularly not being friendly to someone who wants to talk about men's issues.
Yes, we've certainly taken a turn towards the whole woke world, feminist world. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, proudly calls himself a feminist and makes that the focus of a lot of government activity. So, yeah, we're certainly going down that path.
Well, let's see, Canadian federal law for federal jobs, male applicants are automatically disfavored if there is an equally qualified female candidate. So applying for federal work, immediately a man is at a disadvantage. And yet the unemployment
Yes,
rate for men in Canada is significantly higher. And I
yes. Well,
remember,
I I think it's actually worse than you say. What you stated, that if there's an equally qualified female candidate, she'll get the job, is the official position. But the unofficial but actual situation is that there is a preference for hiring even less qualified women over more qualified men.
yes, I remember 4 or 5 years ago, I did a video about how in Alberta in particular, the male unemployment rate was getting historically bad. And if I can just do this for a second here, I remember this story. And there were about four articles that kind of all said the same thing. And something they all said was that this was not unemployment amongst young people going up. This was very specifically young men. The female unemployment rate wasn't nearly as bad. In fact, I don't even think the female unemployment rate went down at all during this time, but the male unemployment rate reached a historic level. And there was another article um, where young men were saying they feel dismayed and despondent, and here we go. It feels pretty dire. This was one I was talking about. It's more or less the same kind of story, but they were uh, interviewing these young men. How do you feel? And they said, well, it feels pretty dire. And their
Yeah.
stories were all kind of the same thing. They can't get work. They can't find a job no matter what they do. Here we go. The unemployment rate for males under the age of 25 in the province at 20%, roughly twice the rate amongst women the same age. And it just makes me think, how bad is it going to get? And why do so many people tolerate this? And we had a conversation earlier where you said that one of the reasons why men's issues are ignored and allowed to fester is that men have lost their moral authority. And you had a very interesting take on that. Do you want to flesh that out a little?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I think that the root here is the difference in empathy, what I call the empathy gap. We simply have more empathy for women and children than we have for men. And so when women suffer in any way from any of these statistical differences, then we address ourselves to it. But when men do, we just don't really care. Now, I think that's been true for a long time. I think that's bred into us because survival of the tribe depended more on survival of the and protection of the women than it did on protection of the men. But a more recent phenomenon is the loss of moral authority, which I think happened principally in the 60s and goes on to this day, where we simply have decided that men are guilty oppressors and women are innocent victims. And that moral difference means that now we don't care about men and we don't think that their issues really matter and that they kind of deserve what they get. That sort of moral judgment has been added on top of the lack of empathy for men. So now, I mean, if you look at statistics about how men are doing, they're pretty bad. Men are 95% of the deaths on the job. They're 85% of the fentanyl overdose deaths. They're 80% of the suicides. They're 75% of the homicide deaths. They're 75% of the suicide deaths. They're 60 to 70% of the homeless. All of these statistics are horrific, and we just really don't pay much attention because they're happening to men and not to women.
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere, Canada is one of the places similar to the UK where it's very, very difficult for a homeless man to find shelter, or a male victim of domestic violence, virtually impossible to find shelter. And it's quite common for homeless men in the Canadian winter to just freeze to death. I mean, is that accurate?
Well, I wouldn't say it's common. It happens. But, we do have some homeless shelters for men. What we don't have are domestic violence shelters for men. And that's because we just have told ourselves, in defiance of all the actual statistics, that domestic violence is a problem, but women suffer as victims and men are perpetrators.
Yeah, there was, I remember about 3 years ago, somebody wanted to open it wasn't exactly a men's shelter. It was partly that, but it was like a men's center. And it was immediately attacked and protested um, by, I have to say, feminist groups. And they couldn't really come up with a reason why it was so bad, other than, well, we're suspicious as to what might be going on in there. And I want to see, here we go. Here we go. Controversial stuff like this. And I'm always reading, it's not that this stuff doesn't happen in the States too, but Canada seems to be, for some reason, just on steroids for all these stories happening. And all
Yeah,
these, here we
Canada
go.
and Australia.
Controversial Center for Man opens in Toronto amid criticism. And a controversial men's rights center opened in Toronto. Let's get that highlighted. A controversial men's rights center opened in Toronto Monday amidst criticism of feminists who say the organization is more concerned about attacking feminism than promoting the health of men. They didn't even give them a chance. I mean, they
Yeah.
weren't even given a chance to do anything.
Yeah,
So
that
I think it's
particular organization I was a member of for quite some time. And I actually opened the Ottawa branch of that organization. I was the project leader for the project to open that center in Ottawa. I was the chair of the board for the first year, and I was the executive director for 3 years. years after that. So I have some firsthand experience of that kind of
Oh, that's
opposition that we received.
that's very, I want now all of a sudden I want to know a lot more about what you just said. Okay, so tell me some of your experiences with that.
Well, I would try to reach out to other agencies that were working uh, with men or with people in general to make friendly connections. And often I would be rebuffed because there was a perception that if you were serving men, then you were serving the perpetrators. You were apologizing for male violence or something like that. and so it remained controversial throughout its life in that sense. Um, so, you know, there's a real need, and the men were grateful, and we were. I think that that organization does good work and is absolutely serving the need. I remember I went to an Ontario government um, what meeting one time where they had invited representatives from social service agencies. Must have been 50 of them in Ottawa to come and talk to the Ontario government and say, which is the provincial government, and say, what do we need? You know, and all of the other agencies were saying things like, well, you've been supporting us in this way, and that's great. Please go on, but here's something new we'd like to ask for. And I got up and I said, well, we've never supported men's issues in any way. Um, so here's a massive opportunity. Half of the population are suffering, and I detailed the ways. And I said, it's all low hanging fruit. It's all massive returns on your investment that you're not going to find anywhere else because there has been no government investment into these areas at all in the past. I had a completely different message. And of course, there was no money forthcoming at all. So
So I mean,
anyway, that's the kind of thing that you're up against when you're working on men's issues.
so let's kind of analyze what this is because we get accused by feminists, as that article said, as you said were told, is, oh, you're not really trying to help men, you're just existing to attack feminism. Well, they attack us just for existing, just for trying to reach out. And it's you were trying to start your own effort, right, for men. You weren't asking to take resources away from feminists. You didn't open up your argument by attacking feminists. Neither did that shelter in Toronto, that center in Toronto, which you were a part of. It was just saying, hey, we want to exist and we want to help men's issues. Immediately get attacked by feminists. So the men's rights movement or the men's movement, however someone identifies, it's not about being anti-feminist, but how are we not supposed to say anything when we get attacked just for existing? You get attacked just for existing. I mean, you try and help male victims, and then because of your trying to help male victims, you were accused of being a male violence apologist.
Yes. Now, I mean, we did have things to say at times about the fact that feminism is very polarized against men, that labels men exclusively as perpetrators and women exclusively as victims. And so, there were some critiques of feminism, and I think that that's justified. But for the most part, what we were doing was trying to help men, indeed. And I also want to say, we did get some support. It wasn't universal hostility. There were some organizations, including organizations that were primarily serving women, that saw the need and recognized that we were trying to do an important, necessary job. But yes, the flavor in general, was quite different than the flavor that I think most women's and family organizations experience. Years ago, I used to go to try to talk about men's issues to various organizations. And I went to service clubs, people like Rotary and that do important volunteer, work in the community. And I went to several and I got a kind of a no strong reaction, right? And then one of them guys took me aside and he said, look, I want to be honest with you, we will do, we're a group and they they consisted of about 95% men. He said, "We're a group that will support women, we'll support children, we'll support families, but you're not going to get us to support men." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "It just doesn't feel right." And
It doesn't feel right.
it just doesn't feel right. He didn't really have a better reason than that. But I thanked him because he'd been honest with me. He'd said, "Look, I want you to understand what you're up against here. This is the facts on the ground." And, so that I take that back to what I said earlier. The issue is fundamentally the empathy gap. We have empathy for women and children. Their lives matter more than men's lives to most people. And that's just a result of evolutionary history. That the tribes that protected their women, because, you need a lot of women to be able to multiply. You don't need many men to keep your numbers up. So we put men out in the risky jobs. We did that and we still do now.
And
So
that was
that's
coming from a man telling you it just doesn't feel right. Did he at least see the merit in what you were doing, or did he kind of say it in a tone like, "Oh, you're one of those misogynistic types"?
No, he was sympathetic. He was saying, look, I see what you're saying. I think there's truth in it, but we're not going to do anything. You're not gonna persuade us.
Do you think it's because he genuinely didn't feel it was the right thing to do, or do you think he was just afraid of what the backlash might have been?
I think there's a bit of both.
A bit of both. Yeah. Because it's very disheartening when I see how many men are completely accepting of common everyday misandry or discrimination against men. And some of the things that I've gotten backlash for truly baffle me. I mean, bringing up very, very basic arguments like we should be looking at why boys are behind in school, or, we should be asking why men are much more likely to be unemployed. And you get branded as, oh, you don't really care about these things. You just secretly hate women. So who is allowed to really care about these things? And what does that look like?
Well, let's talk about empathy because I have a model that explains this to me. I think the natural thing that most people get from history, from the revolutionary history, from the culture, is that we have empathy, or I call it compassion, for women and children without holding them accountable. Have accountability for men without compassion. So that's a kind of a complete polarity. A healthy relationship, you have to be able to hold people accountable, and you have to also have empathy for their situation. The two go together. And when you have parties in a dispute, for instance, if you can find empathy for both parties and accountability for both parties, you've got a foundation for resolving something, for coming to a solution together. But if you're polarized, then you can't. Now, so that's the kind of the inheritance of the culture: compassion without accountability for women, accountability without compassion for men. That's essentially what feminism is. Now, when people get a little bit more advanced, and quite a lot of people in our society are in this place, they add in compassion for men. So there are some people, who are able to feel for men's issues. But there are very few who are able to add the fourth piece of the quadrant, which is accountability for women. So, the issue with feminism is that when you point out problems that it's creating, that's that asks people to hold women accountable. And that's the thing that so few people can do. So, you know, I think that the need is for personal growth on the part of individuals. I don't know what the collective solution is. I really don't have one. I do have a solution for individuals, which is develop yourself towards compassion and accountability for both men and women.
Yeah, I think it's worse than just a lack of empathy for men because people aren't just indifferent to someone talking about men's issues. They're very often hostile. So in the case we saw of that your men censor and your efforts, it wasn't just that people were indifferent and didn't care about it. You got attacked for it. You got accused for it. So it's not just, well, people don't really care if you help homeless men and they just kind of ignore you if you do. People will attack you if you do, just for doing it. So it's not just, it's worse than just a lack of empathy. People really are conditioned into seeing any attempts at addressing men's issues through the lens of a men's movement. They're conditioned to see that as bad.
Well, I do think, though, it comes down to that model that I described, because in that model, if you are somebody who is feels that it's inappropriate, it doesn't feel right to hold women accountable, then anybody who does, anybody who points out that feminism is not actually about equality, feels like they're attacking women inappropriately. That's how it feels, and that's why they get opposed. So the inability to hold women accountable, when somebody holds women accountable, that person is perceived as a misogynist when it's actually a
Right.
healthy thing to be able to do. And so they are opposed.
And there's a lot of women who come to the men's rights movement from feminism and they say, I, when I was going to this feminist group, I was taught essentially to hate or at the very least distrust the men, family, and friends in my life. And that's not what I thought I was signing up for at all.
Yes.
And a lot of men come from feminism saying the same thing. But then you see a lot of men are so convinced in the ideology that you see posts on subreddits like Men's Lib, which is supposed to be a men's rights subreddit, but it's a feminist version of it, saying, I'm uncomfortable being a man. I feel bad because I was born male. I feel guilty for being born male. And it must be very distressing to feel that way. How do you reach someone like that and kind of snap them out of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way that I snapped out of it was by looking at it from first principles, by looking at that sense that I was guilty because of being a man, and I saying, okay, what have I done? What have I actually done? And when I looked at that in detail, I realized that the indictment was empty.
Hang
But
on.
we've got to realize that this is came in as the founding analysis. This male guilt and female relative innocence came in as the founding analysis of the feminist movement, which was history of gender is oppression of women by men. Now, when you say that, then what you're doing is you're saying men are guilty by identity, by virtue of being men. They are guilty as oppressors, and women are innocent by identity. They're innocent as victims. And so when you build in that moral inequality right at the foundation of your movement, then it can't be about equality. It simply can't, because inequality is built in at the root.
I have to go back really quickly because you said what made you snap out of it. So, did you used to be in the feminist ideology headspace? Like, was that once upon a time you?
No, no, but I felt the accusation. I felt the guilt. I felt shame of being accused as a man, and I examined that very carefully. But I also had an advantage in that I grew up in a family where my mother was dominant, my father was weak. And so I had firsthand experience of seeing female power and the abuses of female power because I thought that my mother was wrong about my father. So when I encountered the, the feminist movement, and that happened quite suddenly, I looked at it and I thought, there's something missing here. This isn't the whole story. The way it happened for me was that I was my first marriage had lasted 7 years, and uh, and suddenly my wife told me she was taking our dog to the vet. We had no kids. So I guess she wanted the dog. And then she called me up and said, I've left you. So she went off with the dog. And I said to her, why did you do it that way? Why didn't you talk to me? I didn't even know you were thinking about leaving. And she said, well, I was afraid you'd be violent. And so I suddenly saw this whole story about violent men and victimized women was just brought into my life. And I looked around after that and I thought, there's something very strange happening in the world. And that was how I got interested in gender.
Yeah. Wow. Um, that must have been that must have been a really emotionally striking moment when you heard that. I thought you might be violent. I mean, out of nowhere.
Yeah.
That must have hurt.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I haven't been violent in my adult life. So it was bizarre. And
But she
but
had
it was
her,
but it
I
was very
mean,
real.
there
Did
must have
she really
been.
I also realized, she wasn't making it up. She
Oh yeah, I was gonna
genuinely
say she must have had a valid reason for thinking that. It must have been something that she was just so conditioned to think.
well, it was more than that because I learned later that she went to a lawyer and talked about the potential of divorcing me. And the lawyer told her, don't talk to your husband about these matters, about the fact that you're dissatisfied, because men can get violent. Just leave secretly. So she was actually advised to do that.
Oh wow. And do you think that lawyer was giving that advice in good faith?
I suspect that there was some good faith in it. I suspect also he was protecting himself. Ultimately, lawyers are their first client themselves. Because if she talked to me on his advice and then she got violated, he would be liable.
Or if she
So
talked if she talked to you and you guys saved the relationship, then he lost the client.
yeah, but that's the scarier thing for him to be would be that if she talked to me and I attacked her, then she could sue him.
Well, she could, of course, right.
Yeah,
God,
and
that's
so I think so. So I think he's probably was primarily protecting himself by giving that advice.
and of course, it's not to say that there aren't men who get violent, because of course there are. It's just
Yes,
such a such a shame that simply by being born a man, you are now considered a potential suspect for that
yes, exactly. Yeah, it's a presumption of guilt.
presumption of guilt.
Yeah,
So, all
original
right.
sin.
Um,
Yeah.
I
So
think,
anyway, I went on and I published a magazine on men's issues that looked like this. So we put out about 80 issues over, and there was a different theme on each issue.
oh
Did that for
wow.
12 years, and that was probably the primary magazine of men's issues in Canada for about 12 years. But it couldn't make money. And in the end, I had to stop it because I couldn't support it financially. Then
So, were you the lead editor, lead author? Were you doing the entire thing, or
no, I was the editor and the
okay?
publisher. And so I did an editorial every issue, and I often put an article in the magazine, but most of the content came from contributors.
Wow. And what kind of
It
numbers did you guys put up every month? Was it monthly?
was no, it wasn't monthly. It was a bi-monthly at first, and then it went to a quarterly.
Oh wow.
So it was,
Okay,
and it was typically pretty large, like 60 to 80 pages. And
that's big.
the number of subscribers at S was about 600.
Okay. And did you get any negative backlash for it? Did you get any
Yeah,
hate mail or any?
yeah, I got some, not very much, but got a little bit. But most of it was positive. I mean, it was a private subscription magazine, and so it wasn't really available on newsstands and that kind of thing. So
Well, it gets people
um,
talking.
yeah, yeah, and And then I went on, and I felt like the big oversight in society was we just didn't see the ways that women were powerful. And so I wrote a book about that. I wrote a book, and this is what was it? I published this in 2015. Um, and the intention was to describe the nature of women's social power and to show that it fully balanced men's power. So we had a balanced power situation, but that women's power was different than men's and less easy to see. Yeah, there it is on Amazon.
Yep. The Hand
Yep.
That Rocks the World, An Inconclusive Truth, Power, and Gender. See, I think books like this, books like yours, I should say, and the magazine, I think the reason why they're so potentially powerful is I think a lot of those men, like the man you talked to at Rotary, was it? Who said helping men just doesn't feel right. And you said that part of it was his fear of the backlash. A man might see a book like that and pick it up and read it and think, you know what? I feel this way, but I always feel too afraid to say anything. But obviously, I'm not alone because this other guy, he actually published a book and he put his name on it and he actually published it to the public. So maybe that guy won't go on Facebook and make a status about it. He still wants to keep it secret. But maybe there's this one coworker he knows that he feels, maybe I could share this book with him. And then they have a positive conversation. And then they realize, oh, suddenly now there's two of us here. So I'm not thinking to myself anymore. And those two guys start having conversations. And pretty soon the conversation grows from two to three to five to 10 to a million. And that's how things start.
There's a lot of personal resistance to overcome, and there's a lot of social resistance to overcome. So, I don't see the rate of growth being huge, but I think it's there. I actually, my that book, The Hand That Rocked the World, was my attempt to present sort of factual information in an academic way, in a rigorously well researched, well footnoted way that would be completely rationally convincing. But the numbers of sales were relatively small. So the next thing I did was I put together a book which was designed to be um, to work within the culture, to be persuasive in a way that would be less opposed by the culture. So for that reason, I chose women. Uh, so I edited a book which was 30 stories of women, 30 women's stories about how they were convinced that men's issues were legitimate, how they discovered the legitimacy of men's issues. Because women carry much more weight in the culture. We talked about men have lost moral authority, and talking about gender, women carry a lot more moral authority in the country, so in the culture. So why not use that? So I published in 2017, I published this book,
I was about to pull it up.
Daughters of Feminism. So 30 stories by women about the legitimacy of men's issues. And that one sold, several thousand. So that's more encouraging.
The Cassie J, Karen Strawn, Janice Domingo, David, all names that we know. Wow, fantastic. Fantastic. So let me ask you, we have about 4 minutes left. Let me ask you, you've been doing this for a few decades now. You said you don't think the rate of growth was huge, but has there been growth? Are we better off today than we were 25 years ago in terms of
Uh,
awareness and public acceptance?
I would say in general, no. I think that there is some areas, like I think more people are aware of men's issues, and probably more people think that they are legitimate. But I would say that the virulence of the identity politics movement against men's men's issues has also grown. I think that it is more hostile and more powerful than it used to be. So it's been gains and losses.
Do you think that hostility could, if anything, spur more growth in our favor? I mean, could push people towards us. I mean, more and more
Yes.
men growing up feeling this shame, this guilt, hearing about toxic masculinity, hearing about male privilege, and then seeing everything is supposed to be about equality, and yet they face inequality themselves. And then when they try and bring it up, they get kind of abused for it, or they get accused for it, like you did. Do you think that could backfire and actually help us?
Eventually, I think that the need in the culture to put women on a pedestal, to see them as without major shadow issues, without major abuses of power, and so on, is pretty deep. And it's going to take a lot of negative energy, a lot of negative information about that, a lot of evidence that that is mistaken before we actually take it in. And so I don't think we're there yet. I think there's further to go. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I think the tipping point will be when we finally say, as a culture, this isn't true. You know, women become so um, abusive in the exercise of their cultural dominance that we finally it cannot the image cannot be maintained against the reality.
How much
That'll be the
worse
tipping point. How
is it
much
going to
worse? Quite
get?
a lot. I think it's going to get quite a lot worse.
So Zoom cut us off there for some reason. We were supposed to have like another 90 seconds, but I don't know what happened exactly. But we were kind of wrapping up anyway, and I thought that was a pretty powerful ending. I think it's going to get a lot worse. So um, I talked to different MRAs. Sometimes there's feelings of optimism. Sometimes there's feelings of pessimism. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, I put a link down to his books below, David Shackleton. This has been Faces of the MRM. Thanks for watching.